Welcome to Supernatural, a series of short videos featuring the ministry of Legacy of Worship International, co-founded by my parents, Bill and Lynda Faught. I'm Katie, their youngest daughter, and in today's Supernatural event, this is my dad, Dr. Bill Faught.
Katie, this is the time of the year called Ramadan. And Ramadan is the time of the year when the Muslims around the world are fasting, praying. And what's interesting at this time, they're actually praying to Jesus. Now, not as the Son of God. They don't recognize him as the Son of God, but they do recognize him as a prophet. And prophets speak from God. So they believe that he is a spokesperson for God, if you will. So this is the time of year they actually pray to Jesus that he would speak to them in dreams, in visions. And when he does, this is the time of year, in this next 30 days, more people are converted to Christ from Muslim than any time of the year. And speaking of Muslims, tonight's story is, here on Supernatural, is about Indonesia. Some years ago, in fact it was in 2001, so we're digging back into the archives a little bit here. But this is a crazy, amazing, supernatural story. It's going to bless you. There was a foreign exchange student. Her name is Evita. Evita lived with my parents for about a year, going to school in Oklahoma. And when she arrived, she was already a Christian, but very timid in her faith because the Muslims would persecute them and those things. But while she was here in the States, God marvelously filled her with the Spirit. She became more bold in her faith. Well, I invited her and my parents to come to our 5th annual missions conference that year. That would have been about March of 2001. And it was our custom during those missions conferences is that we would invite people who are representing at least 5 countries. They would come to the microphone and then we would pray for those nations. Now, this was following the worship, so the worship was still going. So this really, the story pulls in worship, prayer and intercession, transformation of nations, all of those things. This is crazy. Wait till you hear this. So anyways, so the last country that we're going to pray for is Indonesia, and I invited Evita, who at that time was only 15 years old. And she came down and she knelt in typical Asian fashion. She knelt in front of the pulpit there on the stage and she began to rock, as a lot of Asians do when they pray. And as she was rocking and just praying, and just a very average, she's not a very loud person, but I tell you, in just short order, it was like God physically walked into the building. Now, for those of you who are saying, well, Brother Bill, you can't go completely on feelings, I get it, okay? But if you would have been there, I think you would have said the same thing, that the presence of God was so thick. There was not a person standing. Everybody went to their face. Everybody went to their face, and they began to pray and intercede as young Evita was praying in her own natural language and rocking and praying. And this probably went on a good 35, 40 minutes maybe. And by the way, if you want to read the entire story, I think most of it's here in my book, Beyond the Gates of Praise. You can find it on our website, legacyofworship.com. But anyways, she began to pray, and there was not a dry eye in the place. There was no one standing. Everyone was prostrate. It's a very deep time of intercession and praying. None of us could understand, because we all spoke English. But after service, I quizzed her and I said, Evita, what were you praying? We really need to know what you're praying. And she said, Brother Bill, I was praying that God would transform, that God would change even our government because there's so much persecution. Well, in June of that year, in May of that year, 2001, during the elections, Indonesia went from a far extreme country, Muslim country. By the way, Indonesia is the largest concentrations of Muslims in the world. But they swung from an extreme government to a more moderate form of government. And the granddaughter of the former most favorite president that they had for some time, she was elected. Now, in June of that year, I visited, and it was such a blessing to connect with her family and all that. But this is really just now starting to get interesting, because in September of that year, if you ever what we call 9/11, okay, September the 11th of 2001 was when the Twin Towers were bombed here or hit by the planes. Here in the States, and one of the first countries that the extreme Muslims reached out to, Katie, was to Indonesia, asking him if they would join the Middle East in the fight against the United States of America. I believe that if God had not so moved, I mean, this is supernatural, if God had not so moved and changed that government from an extreme government, Katie, to a more moderate government, I believe it's entirely possible that we could have got thrown into a World War III. But because they moved from extreme to more moderate government, the government said, no, we're going to stay neutral in this, and we're not going to get involved. So tonight's story is really to first of all, just to raise awareness that God is a supernatural God and He wants to speak to His people. Secondly, to stir your faith that God can do, even through a 15-year-old girl from another country whose English was decent but still somewhat broken, but how that God could use her. And of course, all of us were praying, Katie, but it was just, God literally, shifted almost like the world on its axis. And who knows what all that God did. And we could speculate a lot. But I know that God literally changed that government. And since then, in 2004, when they had the huge tsunami hit that country, the government of Indonesia went public and they said to the missionaries, to all the organizations that feeding programs and all this thing, if you're going to come now. Okay? So Katie, what happened? The church responded. Okay? There was an open door because it was moved from extreme government to moderate government, Katie, and in doing so, they opened their doors, and at that point, Katie, in 2004, they had less than 2% Christians. Wow. Now, the latest facts that I've heard, they are approaching 15% Christians in Indonesia. Now, can a nation be changed? Absolutely. Can God work miracles? Absolutely. Does God do big business? Yes. Is God supernatural? Yes. I pray that as Katie and I share these stories with you, that again your faith is elevated, that you understand that really one of the purposes of the church is to work with God in the earth and to bring transformation to nations. Next week, there will be another story coming to you, and this one will be about Burundi and East Africa. You will not believe. It just gets better. It's supernatural. And these are supernatural events with legacy of worship.